The laughter started before I even reached the dessert table. I heard my name first, twisted into a joke I could not quite make out, and then the sound rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. I turned, and there he was, standing near the chocolate fountain with a glass of champagne in his hand, grinning at me, the way a boy grins when he has just pulled the chair out from under someone. Daniel Croft had a voice built for boardrooms, loud enough to fill a hall without trying. Tonight he used it like a weapon. He said I looked like I had eaten the entire dessert table before arriving. He said it slowly, so nobody would miss it, and the people around him laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from fear of being the next target, rather than real amusement. I stood there in the blue dress I had saved for 4 months to buy. I had tried it on in the shop mirror, and felt, for the first time in a long while, like I belonged somewhere. Now the fabric felt too tight, my skin too visible, my body too loud, in a room full of people who valued quiet, expensive things. My cheeks burned. I wanted to disappear into the marble floor of the Ashford Grand Hall, to become part of the pillars, and the gold trim, and the string quartet playing somewhere behind the noise in my ears. I had come to this gala because my Aunt Margaret worked for the charity hosting it, and she had begged me for weeks to attend, promising it would be good for me to get out of the flat and meet new people. She said the Ashford family knew everyone worth knowing in this city. She said it might open doors. Instead, it felt like every door had slammed shut at once. Daniel took a step closer, clearly enjoying the attention now gathering around him like moths to a flame. He raised his glass toward me, mock toasting, and asked if I planned to visit the dessert table again, or if I had already cleared it out earlier in the evening. Someone near him snorted into their drink. A woman in emerald green pressed her hand to her mouth to hide a smile she should have been ashamed of. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came. My throat had closed around every word I might have used to defend myself. I had spent years building small walls against comments like this, careful walls made of self-talk and quiet reminders that other people's cruelty said more about them than it did about me. Those walls crumbled fast under bright chandeliers and 200 watching eyes. I stepped back, my heel catching slightly on the hem of my dress, and for one terrible second I thought I might actually fall, might give Daniel Croft the final humiliation he seemed so desperate to manufacture. I did not fall, but the room did shift. I felt it before I understood it, a change in the air the way you feel a storm coming, even with your eyes closed. Conversations near the far side of the hall died out first, then spread toward us like a wave pulling back before it crashes. I noticed people turning, not toward me anymore, but past me, toward the entrance. Daniel noticed too. His grin faltered, just slightly, the practiced confidence in his face cracking at the edges. I turned to see what had silenced an entire ballroom. A man walked through the crowd, and the crowd made way for him without seeming to decide to do it. He moved without hurry, dressed in black that fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of tailors who worked only for him and no one else. He did not look left or right. He looked directly at Daniel Croft, and something about that gaze made the temperature in the room feel 10 degrees colder. I did not know his name yet. I only knew that every person near us had gone very still, the way small animals go still when a larger predator enters a clearing. He stopped a few feet from Daniel, close enough that Daniel had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. He said nothing for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became unbearable, pressing down on the whole hall like a held breath. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet, so quiet that people leaned in without meaning to, straining to catch every word. He asked Daniel to repeat what he had just said. Daniel laughed, though it came out thin and unconvincing. He said it was only a joke, nothing serious, just a bit of fun between friends at a party. The man in black did not smile. He said he had not asked for an explanation. He had asked Daniel to repeat it. I watched Daniel's throat move as he swallowed. The confidence that had filled him only moments earlier had drained away entirely, leaving something smaller and more uncertain in its place. He glanced around, searching for support from the crowd that had laughed with him minutes ago. Nobody met his eyes. Nobody wanted to be associated with him now, not with this stranger standing so close, radiating a kind of quiet danger that needed no raised voice to be understood. I stood frozen a few steps away, still holding my small clutch bag in both hands, still feeling the heat of embarrassment on my face, though it had begun to shift into something else. Curiosity, confusion, a strange, unfamiliar feeling of being protected by someone who owed me nothing. The man in black finally turned his head toward me. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but not unkind. He studied my face for a moment, as if trying to memorize it, and something in his expression softened just slightly. He asked if I was all right. I managed a small nod, though my voice still refused to work properly. He turned back to Daniel and told him, in that same low, even tone, that cruelty dressed up as humor was still cruelty, and that men who mocked women in public rooms rarely understood the cost of doing so until it arrived at their door. Daniel tried to laugh it off again, tried to say something about freedom of speech and harmless jokes, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. The stranger did not respond to any of it. He simply looked at Daniel a moment longer, the way someone might look at a problem they had already decided how to solve, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd as smoothly as he had appeared. The hall exhaled all at once. Conversations resumed in nervous, scattered bursts. Daniel stood alone near the chocolate fountain, his face pale, his glass of champagne forgotten in his hand. I did not move for a long moment. My Aunt Margaret found me a minute later, her face full of worry, asking what had happened, who that man was, why everyone looked like they had seen a ghost walk through the hall. I told her I did not know. I told her the truth, which was stranger than any explanation I could have invented. A stranger had defended me. A man with a voice that could silence an entire room without ever being raised. A man whose name I did not yet know, but whose presence had already changed something in me, something I could not name. Margaret glanced across the room, following my gaze toward where the man had vanished into the crowd. She went very quiet, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped low, almost a whisper, as though even saying his name too loudly might summon consequences neither of us understood. She told me the name people used for him when they thought no one important was listening. Adrian Voss. She said it the way people say the names of storms, with a kind of respect that comes only from having seen the damage they can do. I looked back toward the crowd, searching for him, but he had already gone, leaving behind only the memory of his voice and the strange, unsettled feeling that my ordinary, quiet life had just brushed against something far larger than myself, something that would not let me go back to being invisible so easily. I did not know yet how right that feeling would turn out to be. I spent the rest of the evening in a strange fog, smiling at the right moments, nodding along to conversations I barely followed, while my mind kept circling back to the sound of that quiet voice cutting through the noise of the hall. Margaret stayed close to me for the remainder of the night, occasionally glancing toward the far end of the room as though expecting the stranger to reappear. Daniel Croft left early. I noticed him slip out through a side door without saying goodbye to anyone, his usual swagger replaced by a hurried, uneven walk. A few of the people who had laughed loudest at his joke now avoided even looking in the direction he had gone, as if his humiliation might be contagious. When the evening finally ended, Margaret drove me home in silence for the first few minutes, then asked again, more gently this time, if I truly did not know who had stepped in to help me. I told her the truth. I had never seen the man before in my life. I had never even heard his name, until she whispered it in the ballroom. She told me, carefully, the way someone shares information they are not entirely sure they should share, that Adrian Voss was not the kind of man people crossed without reason. She said he owned buildings across half the city, that his name appeared on charity boards and hospital wings, and that beneath all of it ran rumors nobody dared say too loudly in public. She said some called him a businessman, others called him something else entirely, and that both descriptions were probably true at once. I listened without fully understanding, still turning the moment over and over in my mind, replaying the way the entire hall had gone silent for him, the way Daniel's confidence had crumbled the instant those quiet words landed. Back in my flat that night, I sat by the window for a long time before changing out of the blue dress, staring at the city lights without really seeing them. My phone buzzed once with a message from Margaret checking that I had gotten home safely, and I answered it briefly before setting the phone aside. I told myself the night was over, that whatever strange thing had happened at the gala would fade by morning into nothing more than an unusual story to tell. I told myself I would probably never see Adrian Voss again, that our paths belonged to entirely different worlds, his built from marble and quiet threats, mine built from small routines and modest rooms. But some part of me, the part still replaying his voice in my ears, did not quite believe it. My phone rang at 7 in the morning, far too early for anyone I knew to be calling, and the number on the screen did not match any contact I had saved. I almost let it go to silence, still half asleep, still tangled in sheets, and the leftover fog of a strange night. Something made me answer instead, some instinct I could not explain. A woman's voice greeted me, calm and professional, introducing herself as an assistant calling on behalf of Mr. Voss. She asked if I was Claire Bennett. My stomach dropped at the sound of that name, the name Margaret had whispered to me only hours earlier like something dangerous. I confirmed that I was, my voice still rough with sleep, my mind racing to catch up with what was happening. The assistant said Mr. Voss wished to apologize properly for the disruption at the gala and hoped I would allow him to do so in person, at my convenience, wherever I felt comfortable. She said a car could be sent whenever I was ready. I sat up in bed, pulling the blanket around my shoulders as if it could shield me from the strangeness of the moment. Men like Adrian Voss did not call ordinary women the morning after a party to apologize. They did not send assistants to arrange meetings with baristas who lived in small flats above a laundromat. I asked carefully how he had gotten my number. The assistant's tone did not change at all, smooth and practiced, as though the question was expected. She said Mr. Voss had his ways of finding information, and left it at that, the words hanging in the air with a weight I did not fully understand yet. I told her I needed to think about it. She said that was perfectly fine, that Mr. Voss was not a man who pushed, and gave me a number to call if I changed my mind. Then she thanked me and ended the call, leaving me sitting in my bed with my heart pounding for reasons I could not entirely name. I called Margaret first, my thumb hovering over the numbers before I finally pressed send. She answered on the second ring, already sounding worried, as if she had been expecting bad news since the moment we parted ways the night before. I told her everything, the phone call, the assistant, the offer of a car whenever I felt ready. There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke again, her voice lower than usual, careful in a way that made me nervous. She told me stories she had heard over the years, fragments picked up from conversations at charity events, and whispered asides at galas much like the one from the previous night. She said Adrian Voss had built an empire that touched real estate, shipping, and enough legitimate businesses to make his name appear respectable in every newspaper that mentioned him. She said beneath that respectable surface, other rumors persisted. Rumors about debts that vanished along with the people who owed them, about rivals who suddenly lost everything overnight, about a network of loyalty and fear that stretched further than anyone could map. I asked her if she thought I should go. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said she did not know, that a man like that rarely did anything without a reason, and that I needed to decide for myself whether I wanted to find out what his reason might be. I spent the rest of that morning going back and forth in my mind, staring at my phone on the kitchen counter, as if it might answer the question for me. Part of me wanted to ignore the whole thing entirely, to return to my quiet life of morning shifts at the cafe and evenings spent reading in my small flat, undisturbed by mafia bosses and mysterious phone calls. But another part of me, a part I did not fully recognize, kept remembering the way the entire hall had gone silent for him, the way Daniel Croft's confidence had crumbled to nothing in the space of a single sentence. The way he had looked at me afterward, not with pity, but with something closer to concern, as if my humiliation had genuinely bothered him. By early afternoon, curiosity had won out over caution. I called the number the assistant had given me. The car arrived at 4 that afternoon, a black vehicle with tinted windows that looked entirely out of place, parked outside the laundromat beneath my flat. The driver, an older man with a quiet, respectful manner, opened the door for me without asking unnecessary questions, as if driving strangers to meet Adrian Voss was simply part of an ordinary day's work. We drove across the city in near silence, past streets I recognized, and into neighborhoods I had only ever seen from a distance, where buildings grew taller and cleaner, and the sidewalks seemed swept by invisible hands. The car eventually stopped outside a glass tower that caught the afternoon light like a blade, its entrance flanked by security guards who nodded at the driver without a word exchanged. Inside, I was led to an elevator that required a key card, even to select the top floor. My reflection stared back at me from the polished metal doors, and I barely recognized the nervous woman looking back. When the doors opened, I found myself in an office that seemed to stretch endlessly, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the entire city, sprawled out beneath us like a map. Adrian Voss stood near the window with his back to me, his hands clasped behind him, watching the world below with the same quiet intensity he had shown at the gala. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He thanked me for coming, his voice carrying the same low, even tone from the night before, though something in it now seemed softer, less guarded than the version of him that had confronted Daniel Croft in front of 200 witnesses. He gestured toward a chair near his desk, and I sat, still trying to steady the nervous energy pulsing through my chest. He said he owed me an explanation, though he suspected I had already heard plenty of stories about him by now. He asked what Margaret had told me, a small, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth when he said her name, as though he already knew the answer. I told him some of it, the parts about real estate and shipping, and rumors nobody could quite confirm. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, until I finished. He said most of what people whispered about him held at least a grain of truth, though rarely the whole picture. He said the world rewarded men who built empires without asking too many questions about how those empires got built, and that he had long ago stopped correcting people who assumed the worst. I asked him directly why he had stepped in the night before, why a man with his kind of power would bother defending a stranger from a cruel joke at a party he likely attended out of obligation rather than interest. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those dark, unreadable eyes, before he answered. He said cruelty disguised as humor was still cruelty, and that he had little patience for men who mocked others, simply because they believed no one would ever hold them accountable. He said something in the way I had stood there, absorbing the humiliation without collapsing under it, had reminded him of someone he used to know, though he did not elaborate further. I wanted to ask who that someone was, but something in his expression told me the question would not be welcome, not yet. Instead, I asked what had happened to Daniel after he left the gala so suddenly. A flicker of something crossed Adrian's face, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle me. He said Daniel Croft would soon discover that cruelty, once witnessed by the wrong person, tended to carry consequences far beyond a single uncomfortable evening. I did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but something in his tone sent a small chill through me, a reminder that the calm, composed man sitting across from me possessed a kind of power that operated well outside the reach of ordinary consequences. Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, drifting through unexpected topics, my work at the cafe, his early years building the foundation of his current empire, small pieces of ourselves offered carefully, like pieces of a puzzle neither of us was quite ready to complete. When the driver finally returned me home that evening, my mind buzzed with questions I could not yet answer, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth I did not know what to do with. I had gone into that glass tower expecting an apology. I left it with the unsettling feeling that my life had just quietly, irreversibly changed direction. The next morning, I went to work at the cafe as I always did, tying my apron behind my back and pulling my hair into its usual knot, trying to convince myself that nothing about my life had actually changed. The espresso machine hissed the same way it always had. The regular customers ordered the same drinks they always ordered. For a while, the ordinary rhythm of the morning almost made the events of the past 2 days feel like something I had imagined. My coworker Lena noticed something different about me almost immediately. She had a way of reading people that came from years of working behind a counter, watching faces long enough to learn their patterns. She asked if something had happened, her eyebrows raised as she wiped down the counter beside me. I hesitated before answering, unsure how much to share, unsure if any of it would even sound believable out loud. Eventually, I told her a version of the story, leaving out the parts I was still trying to understand myself. She listened with wide eyes, her hands pausing over the counter, and when I finished, she let out a low whistle. She said everyone in the city knew the name Voss, even people like us who moved through entirely different circles than the ones he occupied. She said her cousin worked as a waiter at events sometimes, and had once mentioned seeing Adrian Voss at a fundraiser, describing him as a man who barely spoke, yet seemed to command every room he entered simply by existing in it. I told her that description matched exactly what I had witnessed myself, both at the gala and in his office the day before. Lena leaned closer, lowering her voice even though the cafe was nearly empty at that hour. She asked if I was scared. I thought about the question honestly before answering. I told her I was not entirely sure. Frightened, perhaps, in some small, instinctive way, the way anyone might feel around someone whose power stretched further than they could see, but not frightened of him directly. Something about the way he had looked at me, both at the gala and in his office, had felt more protective than threatening. Lena did not look entirely convinced, but she let the subject drop as customers began trickling in for their morning coffee. Later that day, during my break, I found myself scrolling through the news on my phone out of habit rather than intention. A headline caught my eye almost immediately, small at first, then larger as I read further. Daniel Croft's company had lost a major contract overnight, a deal that had reportedly been finalized just days earlier, only to collapse without explanation from the other party involved. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my coffee growing cold beside me. I thought of Adrian's words from the office, quiet and certain, about consequences that tended to follow cruelty, once witnessed by the wrong person. I did not know for certain that Adrian had anything to do with the collapsed deal. Business contracts fell apart for countless reasons that had nothing to do with mafia bosses or public humiliation at galas. But the timing sat uneasily in my chest, refusing to be dismissed as simple coincidence. I thought about texting Adrian to ask, then stopped myself, uncertain if I even had the right number, uncertain if asking would open a door I was not yet ready to walk through. Instead, I finished my shift in a distracted haze, going through the familiar motions of steaming milk and calling out orders, while my mind wandered back again and again to that glass office high above the city, to the man who had looked at me like I mattered, though I still did not fully understand why. That evening, as I walked home along my usual route past the small bookshop and the corner grocery, a car slowed beside me on the street. I tensed instinctively, my hand tightening around the strap of my bag, until the window rolled down and I recognized the same driver who had taken me to Adrian's office the day before. He offered me a ride home, polite and unassuming as always, and though something in me hesitated, another part of me, curious and restless, accepted without much resistance. The ride was quiet, comfortable, in a way I had not expected, and as we pulled up outside my building, the driver mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Mr. Voss had asked him to check that I arrived home safely each evening for the time being. I sat with that information long after the car pulled away, turning it over in my mind as I climbed the stairs to my flat. A man like Adrian Voss did not concern himself with the safety of ordinary women without reason. Whatever this was becoming, I understood clearly that it had already moved far beyond a single apology for a single cruel night. A knock at my door at nearly midnight sent my heart racing before I even reached the handle. I had been half asleep on the couch, a book fallen open across my chest, when the sound startled me upright. Nobody knocked on my door this late, not in a building where most of my neighbors kept to themselves, and the hallway lights flickered with age. I approached carefully, checking through the small peephole before unlocking anything. A young man stood outside, nervous, clutching an envelope against his chest like it might protect him from something. I opened the door only partway, the chain still fastened, and asked what he wanted. He said he worked for Daniel Croft, that Daniel had sent him to deliver a message, though his voice shook slightly as he said it, as if he did not entirely agree with whatever task he had been given. I asked what kind of message required delivery at midnight to a stranger's flat. He held up the envelope, his hand trembling faintly, and said Daniel wanted me to know that whatever I thought I had gained by involving Adrian Voss in his business, I would come to regret it. He said Daniel's lawyers were preparing something, though he did not seem entirely convinced by his own words as he said them. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, fear and anger tangled together in a way I had not expected. I told the young man I had not involved myself in anything, that Daniel's problems belonged entirely to Daniel, and that he should leave before I called for help. He hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway, then set the envelope on the ground outside my door, and left without another word. His footsteps hurried against the old floorboards. I stood frozen for a long moment, before finally picking up the envelope with shaking hands. Inside, a single printed page contained words that made my chest tighten with unease. Vague threats disguised as warnings, references to Daniel's connections in the city, a clumsy attempt to frighten me into distancing myself from Adrian. I read it twice before setting it down on my kitchen counter, my hands still trembling slightly. Whatever fear the letter intended to create had arrived exactly as planned, though beneath that fear, something else stirred as well, a flicker of anger at being targeted for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. I did not sleep much that night, my mind circling endlessly around the letter, around Daniel's desperation, around the strange, tangled situation I had somehow found myself inside without ever meaning to. The next morning, I called the number Adrian's assistant had given me, my voice unsteady as I explained what had happened. Within 20 minutes, the same black car appeared outside my building, the driver's expression grave as he escorted me quickly to the vehicle. Adrian met me not in his glass tower this time, but in a quiet office attached to a warehouse near the edge of the city, a space far less polished than his usual surroundings, though still carrying the same quiet authority in every detail. He read the letter I brought him without any visible reaction at first, his eyes moving carefully across each line before he finally set it down on the desk between us. He asked if the young man who delivered it had said anything else, any names, any details worth remembering. I told him everything I could recall, my voice steadier now that I sat across from someone who seemed entirely unbothered by the threat itself. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, the first real sign of anger I had seen from him since the gala. He said Daniel had made a mistake far greater than the one that started all of this, that threatening someone under his protection crossed a line few people survived crossing. I asked what he meant by protection, my curiosity overtaking some of my lingering fear. He met my eyes directly, his expression softening just slightly. He said that from the moment he stepped between Daniel and myself at the gala, he had made a choice, whether either of us had fully understood it at the time. He said men in his position rarely intervened publicly without intending to see the matter through completely. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me, a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort, because the fear from the night before had begun to ease slightly in his presence. Unease, because I understood now that I had stepped, whether by choice or accident, into a world governed by rules I did not fully understand. He asked if I wanted him to handle Daniel directly, his tone leaving no doubt about what handling meant in his particular world, though he did not elaborate further, watching my reaction carefully. I hesitated, uncertain how to answer. Part of me wanted Daniel to simply disappear from my life entirely, to face whatever consequences awaited him, without my involvement in deciding what those consequences should look like. Another part of me, still holding on to some remnant of ordinary morality, worried about what handling might actually mean. I told him I did not want anyone hurt, that I only wanted the threats to stop, that I wanted to return to my quiet, ordinary life, without envelopes appearing at my door in the middle of the night. Something in his expression shifted at my answer, a flicker of what might have been respect crossing his features. He said he understood, and that Daniel would learn, one way or another, that threats carried consequences even when violence remained off the table entirely. Over the following days, I noticed changes in my daily routine that I had not requested, but could not entirely refuse. A car appeared outside my building each morning to drive me to work, and again each evening to bring me home. At first, I resisted, insisting I could manage my own commute as I always had. Adrian, through his assistant, gently but firmly insisted otherwise, at least until the situation with Daniel resolved itself completely. Lena noticed the car immediately on my second day of this new arrangement, her eyes wide as she watched me climb out of the sleek black vehicle outside the cafe. She peppered me with questions throughout our shift, her curiosity impossible to contain, and I found myself sharing more details than I had originally intended: the letter, the meeting at the warehouse, Adrian's quiet promise of protection. She listened with a mixture of excitement and concern, eventually asking the question I had been avoiding even in my own thoughts. She asked if I was starting to have feelings for him. I laughed the question off at first, insisting the entire situation felt far too strange, far too complicated, to consider anything beyond simple gratitude for his protection. But even as I said the words, I knew they rang hollow. I thought about him more often than I wanted to admit, replayed our conversations in my mind during quiet moments, found myself looking forward to the brief exchanges we shared whenever his driver picked me up or dropped me off. A few days after my visit to the warehouse office, I received an unexpected call from Daniel himself, his voice thick with something that sounded almost like desperation, rather than the cold arrogance he had displayed at the gala. He asked me to meet him, insisting he only wanted to talk, that he understood now how badly he had misjudged the consequences of a single careless joke. I hesitated, my instincts warning me against agreeing, yet some part of me, curious and perhaps foolishly forgiving, wanted to hear what he had to say. I told him I would meet him only in public, at a coffee shop near the university library rather than anywhere private, and he agreed without argument, his eagerness almost unsettling in itself. When I arrived the following afternoon, Daniel already sat waiting at a corner table, his appearance strikingly different from the confident, polished man I remembered from the gala. Dark circles ringed his eyes, his usually perfect suit rumpled, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee he did not seem to be drinking. He stood as I approached, pulling out my chair with an awkward, unfamiliar politeness, before sitting back down across from me. He apologized almost immediately, the words tumbling out quickly, as though he had rehearsed them many times before finally working up the courage to say them aloud. He said he never intended for his comment to spiral into something so devastating, that he had lost his largest contract, that his fiancée had left him after certain private messages of his had somehow become public, that his own family had begun distancing themselves from him out of fear of association. I listened without much sympathy at first, remembering clearly the humiliation I had felt standing beside the chocolate fountain while he mocked me in front of 200 strangers. Yet as he continued speaking, something in his voice shifted from self-pity toward genuine fear, and despite everything, a small part of me softened slightly. He asked if I could speak to Adrian on his behalf, if I could somehow convince him to ease whatever pressure continued mounting against him. He said he understood now what he had done wrong, that he would apologize publicly if it meant the consequences might finally stop. I told him honestly that I had no real influence over Adrian's decisions, that I barely understood the full scope of what Adrian controlled, or how his particular form of justice operated. Daniel's expression fell further at my answer, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed with a message from the driver, informing me he had arrived outside to take me to my next shift. I stood to leave, and Daniel reached out, briefly touching my arm before pulling back immediately, as though remembering himself. "Arnheems," he said quietly, that he hoped I would at least consider speaking with Adrian, that his entire future now rested on decisions being made somewhere far above either of our heads. I left the coffee shop with a strange, unsettled feeling weighing on my chest, uncertain what to make of the conversation, uncertain whether Daniel's fear represented genuine remorse, or simply the panic of a man realizing, too late, that actions carried consequences after all. That evening, I mentioned the meeting to Adrian almost hesitantly, unsure how he would react to learning I had spoken with Daniel without consulting him first. His expression grew serious as I recounted the conversation, his jaw tightening slightly at certain details, though he did not interrupt until I finished speaking entirely. He asked if Daniel had threatened me in any way during the meeting, and I assured him he had not, that the man I met bore little resemblance to the confident figure from the gala, reduced instead to something smaller, more desperate. Adrian considered this information carefully before responding. He said Daniel's fear, while perhaps genuine, did not erase the cruelty of his original actions, nor the additional foolishness of sending a midnight threat to my door afterward. He said mercy, in his experience, needed to be earned through more than simple desperation. I asked if that meant he intended to continue whatever pressure he had already set into motion against Daniel's business and reputation. He met my eyes steadily and said the consequences already unfolding around Daniel had been set in motion by choices Daniel made entirely on his own, long before either of us had ever crossed paths. He said he had merely ensured those choices finally caught up with him, nothing more, nothing fabricated or invented beyond what already existed in the shadows of Daniel's own conduct. Something about his calm, measured explanation eased some of the unease I had carried since leaving the coffee shop, though a small, persistent worry remained, a quiet awareness that Daniel's desperation might not end quietly, that cornered men sometimes made choices even more reckless than the ones that had cornered them in the first place. Nearly a week after the midnight letter, Adrian called to ask if I would join him for dinner, not at his office this time, but at a small restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, one that clearly valued discretion over flashy decor. I agreed, nervous energy building throughout the day as I prepared, second-guessing every outfit choice, before finally settling on something simple, something that felt like myself rather than an attempt to impress him. Dinner unfolded slower than our previous meetings, conversation drifting easily between lighter topics, favorite books, childhood memories, small details of ordinary lives that felt worlds away from mafia bosses and midnight threats. I found myself laughing more than I expected, watching as small cracks appeared in his usually composed exterior, glimpses of warmth and humor hidden beneath layers of careful control. Near the end of the meal, I finally asked him directly about Daniel, about what had truly happened to the contract, to the sudden collapse of his once secure business dealings. Adrian set down his glass slowly, considering his answer with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. He said Daniel's partners had simply been made aware of certain financial irregularities that had gone unnoticed until now, irregularities that happened to be entirely true, uncovered rather than fabricated. He said he had not needed to invent anything against Daniel. He had only needed to shine a light on what already existed, hidden beneath years of careless arrogance. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling oddly relieved that Adrian's methods, at least in this instance, had not required outright deception, only exposure of truths Daniel had clearly hoped would remain buried forever. As dinner drew to a close, Adrian walked me outside himself instead of sending me ahead with the driver, the night air cool against my skin as we stood beneath the restaurant's small awning. He asked if the arrangement of daily car rides and careful oversight felt too intrusive, if I wanted him to ease back and allow me more independence, now that the immediate danger from Daniel's midnight threat had likely passed. I surprised myself with my own answer, admitting that I did not mind the arrangement nearly as much as I had expected to, that some part of me had grown used to, even fond of, the quiet presence of his protection woven through my ordinary days. He studied my face for a long moment beneath the dim streetlight, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes, before he finally said that he intended to keep me safe for as long as I would allow it, regardless of what that protection might eventually cost him. I did not fully understand what he meant by cost, not that night, standing so close to him beneath a quiet awning while the city moved on around us, indifferent to the strange, careful thing beginning to grow between us. But I understood enough to know that whatever this was becoming, I no longer wanted to walk away from it, even as some small, cautious part of me whispered that Daniel Croft would not remain quiet forever, and that the true cost of Adrian's protection had likely not yet arrived. The drive home that night felt different from every ride before it. I watched the city lights blur past the window, thinking of Daniel's trembling hands wrapped around his coffee cup, of Adrian's steady voice promising protection without asking anything in return, of the strange, uneven path that had carried me from a humiliating moment beside a chocolate fountain to whatever quiet, complicated thing now sat unfolding between myself and a man the entire city seemed to fear. I did not have answers for any of it yet. I only knew that turning back no longer felt possible, and that some part of me, the part that had once shrunk beneath Daniel's cruel laughter, had begun, slowly and carefully, to stand a little taller. Glass shattered somewhere below my window, sharp and sudden, jolting me awake in the middle of the night. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. For a moment, silence returned, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic several streets away. Then I heard footsteps, quick and uneven, retreating down the alley beside my building. I moved carefully to the window, peering through the curtain without fully exposing myself, and saw nothing but shadows and the faint glow of a street lamp. Below, near the entrance to the laundromat, a car window had been shattered, glass scattered across the pavement, though the vehicle itself did not belong to me or anyone I recognized. My hands trembled as I called Adrian's number directly this time, a number he had given me himself only days earlier, insisting I use it rather than going through his assistant if anything ever felt wrong. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the late hour, as though he rarely slept deeply enough to be caught off guard by anything. I explained what had happened, my voice unsteady, and within minutes, headlights appeared outside my building, the familiar black car pulling up faster than I had ever seen it move before. Adrian arrived himself this time, rather than sending the driver alone, his expression tight with barely restrained anger, as he inspected the shattered glass below my window, speaking quietly with two men I did not recognize who arrived shortly after him. He came upstairs once he finished his assessment, finding me still shaken, wrapped in a blanket on my couch, unable to fully calm the anxious energy still coursing through me. He sat beside me, closer than he usually allowed himself, and asked gently if I was truly all right, his usual composed exterior cracking slightly to reveal something rawer underneath, something that looked remarkably like fear. I told him I was fine, though my voice betrayed the lingering unease still gripping my chest. I asked if he believed Daniel was responsible for whatever had happened outside, or if this represented something else entirely. His jaw tightened as he considered the question. He said his men would investigate thoroughly, that nothing about the incident felt random, though he could not yet confirm Daniel's direct involvement. I studied his face in the dim lighting of my small living room, noticing new lines of worry etched across his forehead, worry I had not seen from him even during our conversation about the midnight letter days earlier. I asked him, finally, the question that had been building inside me since that very first night at the gala. I asked why a man with his power, his resources, his carefully guarded reputation, continued involving himself so deeply in the protection of someone he barely knew. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the city lights glowing faintly beyond the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something older, something carefully buried beneath years of careful control. He told me about his childhood, about growing up in a part of the city far removed from glass towers and tailored suits, where his family struggled to afford even basic necessities, where other children mocked him relentlessly for the second-hand clothes he wore, for the way his family's poverty marked him as different, as less than. He said he remembered standing in similar moments to the one I had experienced at the gala, humiliated in front of crowds who found cruelty entertaining, powerless to defend himself in any way that mattered. He said he had promised himself, even as a child, that he would build a life where no one could ever laugh at him like that again, where his presence alone would be enough to silence a room rather than fuel its laughter. He said watching Daniel mock me that night had stirred something old and unresolved within him, a memory of his own childhood helplessness he had spent decades trying to outrun. He said stepping between us had felt less like a choice, and more like an instinct he could not have suppressed even if he tried. I sat with his words for a long moment, feeling something shift between us, a deeper understanding forming beneath the surface of everything that had happened over the past weeks. I understood now that his protection of me was not simple attraction or passing curiosity, but something rooted far deeper, something tied to his own unhealed wounds. I asked carefully if he ever worried that his methods, the fear he inspired, the quiet threats woven through his empire, made him no different from the people who had once hurt him. His expression grew troubled at the question, and for a long moment, he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped even lower, almost a whisper. He said he worried about exactly that, more often than anyone knew. He said power built from fear carried its own kind of loneliness, that very few people ever approached him without calculation, without some hidden agenda lurking behind their kindness. He said something about my presence, my honesty, the way I had looked at him with genuine curiosity rather than fear or greed, had cut through that loneliness in a way he had not expected and did not entirely know how to handle. I reached out then, my hand finding his, our fingers intertwining slowly in the quiet space between us. He looked down at our joined hands for a long moment before meeting my eyes again, something vulnerable and uncertain flickering across his usually unreadable expression. Neither of us spoke for a while after that, simply sitting together in the dim light of my small living room, the earlier fear from the shattered glass slowly giving way to something quieter, steadier, though the tension of the unresolved threat still lingered somewhere beneath the surface. Eventually, his phone buzzed, and he stepped away briefly to answer it, his expression growing serious as he listened to whoever spoke on the other end. When he returned, he told me his men had found something near the shattered car window, a folded note tucked beneath the windshield wiper, containing a single line that made his expression harden into something colder than I had yet seen from him. He did not show me the note directly, insisting it contained nothing I needed to see, though his tightened jaw and the barely restrained anger in his voice told me enough. He said Daniel had likely crossed a line from desperate posturing into something far more dangerous, something that could no longer be handled through quiet financial pressure alone. I felt a fresh wave of fear settle over me at his words, though beneath that fear, a strange kind of resolve began forming as well. I told him I did not want to hide, that I refused to let Daniel's escalating desperation trap me inside my own flat, afraid of every shadow and every sound. Adrian studied me carefully, something like respect mixing with his lingering worry as he listened to my resolve. He said he would ensure my safety regardless, but that he understood my refusal to let fear dictate my choices, that it reminded him again of the same resilience he had noticed the very first night we met. Before he left that night, he paused at my door, turning back briefly to study my face in the dim hallway light. He said quietly that whatever happened next, he intended to see this through completely, that Daniel's escalating recklessness would not go unanswered. I watched him disappear down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet of the building, and stood there for a long moment afterward, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded between us settle deeper into my chest. Whatever fragile, complicated thing was growing between Adrian and myself, it had moved far beyond simple gratitude or curiosity now. It had become something neither of us could easily walk away from, bound together by shared vulnerability, mutual protection, and the growing certainty that Daniel Croft, cornered and desperate, would not stop until someone forced him to. I did not sleep much after Adrian left that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words about his childhood, about the promise he had made to himself long before he ever became the man the city whispered about with equal parts fear and respect. It struck me how strange it was that the very thing which made people afraid of him, his cold, unshakable control, had been built from the same wound I carried myself, the memory of standing exposed in front of people who found my humiliation entertaining. The next morning, Margaret called, her voice tight with worry, after hearing about the shattered car window from a mutual friend who lived nearby. I told her most of what had happened, though I left out the details of the note Adrian had refused to show me, unwilling to worry her further than necessary. She asked, gently, if I had considered stepping back from this entire situation, if perhaps the safest choice was to distance myself from Adrian entirely and let his conflict with Daniel resolve itself without my continued involvement. I understood her concern, and some rational part of me even agreed with it. Yet when I tried to imagine simply walking away, returning to my quiet, unremarkable life, as though none of this had happened, something inside me resisted the idea entirely. I had spent years making myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt genuinely seen, protected, valued, exactly as I was. I told Margaret I could not walk away, not yet, and though she did not sound entirely convinced, she did not push further, simply reminding me to be careful, and to call her if anything else happened. Later that day, Adrian sent the driver to bring me to the warehouse office again, explaining through a brief message that his security team had gathered more information overnight that he wanted to share with me directly rather than through a phone call. When I arrived, I found him standing near the window exactly as he had been during our very first meeting in his glass tower, though the tension in his shoulders now carried a different quality entirely, sharper, more focused. He explained that his men had traced the shattered window and the note left behind to a small group Daniel had recently begun associating with, men known less for legitimate business dealings and more for handling problems through intimidation. He said Daniel, increasingly desperate as his legitimate options collapsed around him, had apparently sought help from people far more dangerous than himself, hoping their reputation alone might be enough to frighten Adrian into backing off. I asked if that meant the danger had grown beyond what either of us initially understood. Adrian's expression grew serious as he considered his answer. He said every escalation carried risk, but that he had dealt with far more dangerous men than the ones Daniel had foolishly aligned himself with. He said his greater concern was not for himself, but for me, caught in the middle of a conflict I had never asked to be part of. I told him I understood the risk, that I had understood it since the moment the assistant first called me the morning after the gala, and that despite everything, I did not regret any of the choices that had led me here. Something in his expression softened at my words, though the tension in his posture did not fully ease. He said he intended to increase security around my flat and my daily movements, at least until the situation with Daniel and his newfound associates resolved itself completely. I did not argue this time, understanding that his caution came from genuine concern, rather than any desire to control or restrict me. We spent the remainder of that visit discussing smaller, quieter details, the kind of easy, ordinary conversation that felt like a small refuge from the growing danger surrounding us, and for a while, sitting together in his warehouse office, as afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor, it almost felt possible to forget how precarious everything around us had become. But even in that quiet moment, some part of me remained aware that the danger had not passed, only paused, gathering itself somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to arrive. A stranger grabbed my arm outside the cafe before I even registered his presence. I had just finished my closing shift, stepping out into the cool evening air with my keys already in hand, when a firm grip closed around my elbow, pulling me sideways into the narrow alley beside the building. I gasped, my keys clattering to the pavement, my mind scrambling to process what was happening, even as instinct screamed at me to fight back. The man holding me was large, unfamiliar, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the alley. He leaned close, his voice low and threatening, telling me to deliver a message to Adrian Voss, that his associates had grown tired of waiting for a peaceful resolution, that patience among certain circles had officially run out. My heart pounded violently against my ribs as I tried to pull away, my mind racing through everything Adrian had told me about increased security, about drivers meant to protect exactly these kinds of moments. Where had they gone? Why had no one intervened yet? Before panic could fully overtake me, footsteps pounded rapidly down the alley, and within seconds, the man's grip loosened entirely as he was yanked backward by someone I recognized immediately as one of Adrian's security team, a quiet, serious man named Marcus, who had been trailing me discreetly for days without my full awareness. The stranger struggled briefly before realizing he was outnumbered, two more of Adrian's men arriving swiftly to secure the situation. Marcus asked if I was all right, his usually calm demeanor sharpened with obvious concern, while the other men restrained the stranger against the alley wall. I nodded, though my hands shook uncontrollably as adrenaline continued flooding through my system. Marcus immediately called Adrian, relaying the situation in clipped, urgent sentences, and within minutes, I heard the familiar sound of Adrian's car screeching to a stop at the mouth of the alley. He emerged quickly, his usual composed exterior completely abandoned, replaced by something raw and furious, as he took in the scene before him, the restrained stranger, my trembling form still pressed against the alley wall where I had stumbled back in fear. He reached me first, his hands gentle, despite the fury radiating from every other part of him, checking carefully to ensure I had not been physically harmed beyond the initial fright. Once satisfied I was unharmed, his attention turned toward the man his security team held restrained, his expression turning colder than I had ever witnessed from him. He asked the stranger, in a voice stripped of any warmth whatsoever, who had sent him. The man remained silent at first, though his eyes betrayed genuine fear, as Adrian stepped closer, his presence alone seeming to fill the entire alley with an unbearable weight. Eventually, under that unrelenting silence, the stranger broke, admitting that Daniel Croft had hired him, and several others, promising substantial payment for whatever it took to force Adrian into backing off entirely. Adrian's jaw tightened at the confirmation, though something in his expression shifted from pure anger into a colder, more calculated resolve. He instructed his men to take the stranger away for further questioning, then turned his full attention back to me, guiding me gently out of the alley and into his waiting car. We drove in tense silence for several minutes before he finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. He said Daniel's desperation had officially crossed into territory that could no longer be handled through financial pressure or quiet warnings. He said tonight marked the end of whatever patience he had extended toward Daniel's increasingly reckless behavior. I asked, carefully, what that meant exactly, uncertain if I truly wanted to know the answer. He met my eyes steadily, his expression unreadable once more, though something softer flickered beneath the surface when he looked at me. He said he intended to expose Daniel completely and publicly, not through violence, but through undeniable proof of every fraudulent, dishonest choice Daniel had made throughout his career, proof that would end not just his reputation, but any possibility of him ever threatening anyone again. 2 days later, Adrian invited me to another gala, this one hosted by a rival charity organization, though he assured me the guest list overlapped significantly with the one from the night everything began. I hesitated initially, memories of standing humiliated beside the chocolate fountain still lingering uncomfortably in my mind. Adrian sensed my hesitation and took my hand gently, promising that this night would look nothing like the last, that I would walk into that hall not as someone to be mocked, but as someone standing beside him, protected and respected in equal measure. I chose my dress carefully this time, not out of anxiety about how others might perceive me, but out of genuine confidence, a feeling I had not experienced in longer than I could remember. When Adrian arrived to collect me that evening, his expression as he saw me standing in the doorway told me everything I needed to know about how far we had both come since that first uncertain gala. The Ashford Grand Hall looked much the same as it had weeks earlier, chandeliers glittering above elegantly dressed guests, string quartet music drifting gently through the air. Yet everything about my experience walking through those doors felt entirely different this time. Adrian's hand steady against the small of my back, his presence alone enough to draw respectful nods from guests who would have previously ignored someone like me entirely. We had not been inside more than 20 minutes when a commotion arose near the entrance, voices rising sharply enough to draw attention from across the hall. I turned, along with dozens of other guests, to see Daniel Croft storming through the doorway, his expression wild, his usual polished composure entirely abandoned. He spotted Adrian almost immediately, marching directly toward us despite the nervous whispers rippling through the surrounding crowd. Security guards moved to intercept him, but Adrian raised a hand slightly, signaling them to hold back, watching Daniel's approach with calm, unshaken patience. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his breathing heavy, his eyes darting between myself and Adrian with something bordering on desperation. He began speaking loudly, accusing Adrian in front of the entire gathered crowd of sabotage, of manipulation, of using illegal means to destroy his business and reputation without justification. The hall fell into stunned silence, every guest turning to watch the confrontation unfold. I felt my pulse quicken, though standing beside Adrian, I felt none of the crushing vulnerability I had experienced during my first humiliation in this very room. Adrian allowed Daniel to finish his tirade completely before responding, his voice calm and measured, carrying easily across the silent hall without ever needing to rise in volume. He said Daniel's accusations, while dramatic, conveniently overlooked the true source of his downfall, choices Daniel himself had made, long before either of us ever crossed paths. He said calmly that he happened to have proof of exactly those choices with him tonight, having anticipated Daniel's desperate need for one final public spectacle. At his signal, one of his associates stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed documents projected briefly onto a nearby screen normally reserved for the charity's donation totals. Financial records appeared before the shocked crowd, clear evidence of fraudulent transactions, falsified reports, and stolen funds that Daniel had carefully hidden for years beneath his polished public image. Gasps rippled through the hall as guests began recognizing the implications of what they were witnessing, whispers turning rapidly from confusion into outrage directed squarely at Daniel rather than Adrian. Daniel's face drained of all color as he stared at the projected evidence, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging. He turned toward the crowd, searching desperately for any hint of support, finding none among the very people who had once laughed alongside him at my expense weeks earlier. Security guards, no longer restrained by Adrian's earlier gesture, moved forward to escort Daniel from the premises, his protests growing weaker with every step as reality of his complete and public downfall settled fully over him. I watched him disappear through the same doors he had stormed through minutes earlier, feeling an unexpected wave of something complicated wash over me, not quite satisfaction, not quite pity, but something in between. The strange, heavy relief of watching cruelty finally meet consequences it could no longer escape. Adrian turned to me once the commotion fully settled, the hall slowly returning to its previous rhythm of quiet conversation and clinking glasses, though the energy in the room had shifted permanently, charged now with the memory of what everyone had just witnessed. He asked, quietly, if I was all right, if the confrontation had brought back too many painful memories of the humiliation I had endured in this same room weeks earlier. I considered the question honestly before answering. I told him that standing here now, beside him, watching Daniel's cruelty finally collapse under the weight of his own choices, felt entirely different from the helpless humiliation I had experienced before. I told him I did not feel small anymore, not in this room, not anywhere. Something in his expression softened completely at my words, the last remnants of tension from the confrontation melting away into something warmer, more open than I had ever seen from him. He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine in front of the entire watching crowd, no longer concerned with discretion or careful distance. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, that he intended to ensure I never felt small again, not while he remained anywhere within reach to prevent it. I smiled up at him, feeling the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced instead by something steady and warm, settling deep in my chest. We stayed at the gala for another hour, moving easily through the crowd together, guests who had once ignored me, now offering polite greetings, genuine curiosity replacing the casual cruelty I had experienced during my very first visit to this hall. Margaret found us eventually, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she embraced me tightly, whispering how proud she felt, watching how far I had come since that humiliating night weeks earlier. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian walked me out beneath the same entrance where Daniel had once so cruelly mocked me, though the memory no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. Instead, standing beneath those same lights, I felt only quiet gratitude for the strange, unexpected path that had led me here. Adrian paused before helping me into the car, turning to study my face beneath the soft glow of the entrance lights. He said that from the very first moment he saw me standing there, refusing to crumble entirely beneath Daniel's cruelty, he had recognized something in me worth protecting, worth knowing more deeply. I told him that whatever this had become between us, I no longer wanted to imagine my life without it, without him standing steadily beside me through whatever challenges still remained ahead. He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually guarded features into something softer, more vulnerable than the powerful, feared man the entire city whispered about. He leaned down slowly, and I met him halfway, the kiss gentle and certain, sealing quietly everything we had both grown to understand about each other over these past complicated, transformative weeks. As we finally settled into the car, the city lights blurring softly past the windows, I thought back to that humiliating moment beside the chocolate fountain, to the cruel laughter that had once made me want to disappear entirely. I understood now that moment, however painful, had ultimately led me here, toward a strength I had not known I possessed, toward a man who saw value in me long before I had learned to see it fully in myself. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, I no longer faced them as the woman who had once shrunk beneath cruel laughter in a crowded ballroom. I faced them instead as someone finally, completely, unshakably certain of her own worth. In the weeks that followed, the story of Daniel's public downfall spread quickly through the circles he had once dominated so effortlessly. His company collapsed entirely under the weight of the exposed fraud, criminal investigations opening swiftly once the projected evidence found its way into the hands of proper authorities. I heard, secondhand through Margaret, that he had left the city entirely, retreating somewhere quiet and far from the world that had once celebrated his arrogance. I found, to my own surprise, that I did not spend much time thinking about him at all once the initial relief of his departure settled fully into place. My days filled instead with new routines, new comforts I had never expected to find myself embracing so completely. Adrian and I continued seeing each other regularly, our relationship deepening steadily beyond the tension and danger that had first brought us together. He introduced me, slowly and carefully, to more corners of his world, some of them polished and public, others quieter, guarded more closely from outside eyes. I learned to navigate both with growing confidence, understanding gradually the delicate balance he maintained between the respectable businessman the world saw and the far more complicated man operating beneath that careful surface. Lena teased me relentlessly at the cafe, whenever the black car appeared outside each morning, though her teasing carried genuine happiness for me beneath its playful edge. She often reminded me how far I had come since that first anxious morning after the gala, when I had sat frozen at the kitchen counter, uncertain whether to trust the strange, powerful man who had inserted himself so suddenly into my quiet life. Margaret, too, watched the changes in me with quiet satisfaction, occasionally remarking during our weekly dinners how different I seemed now, how the woman who once shrank instinctively from attention had grown into someone who walked into rooms with her shoulders back and her chin lifted, unafraid of whatever whispers might follow. One evening, several months after the gala where Daniel's downfall had unfolded so publicly, Adrian invited me to the same warehouse office where our relationship had first deepened during those tense, uncertain weeks of threats and midnight fears. The space had changed slightly since then, warmer somehow, though the quiet authority it carried remained entirely intact. He told me that evening, without any of his usual careful hesitation, that he wanted me fully in his life, not simply as someone he protected from danger, but as an equal partner standing beside him through whatever challenges his complicated world might still bring. I told him honestly and without hesitation of my own that I wanted exactly the same thing, that the fear I had once carried around men like him had long since transformed into something steadier, something built on genuine trust rather than simple gratitude for protection offered. We stood together near the same window where he had once watched the city below, with quiet, guarded intensity, during our very first meeting. This time, he did not stand alone. I stood beside him, watching the same view together, understanding fully now how completely our paths had become intertwined since that single, humiliating moment beside a chocolate fountain, weeks that felt like a lifetime ago. Looking back, I understood clearly that Daniel's cruelty, however painful in the moment, had inadvertently opened a door I never would have found otherwise, leading me toward a strength within myself I had never fully recognized, and toward a man who valued that strength more deeply than anyone I had ever known before. The city lights glittered below us, endless and indifferent to the small, personal transformations unfolding within any single life. Yet standing there beside Adrian, his hand finding mine easily in the quiet stillness of the evening, I felt entirely certain that whatever came next, I would face it, not as the woman who had once been mocked into silence, but as someone who had finally, fully, learned her own worth.